Thank you very much for your very kind and generous words of introduction. I'm very happy to be here amongst you today. It's an honor for me, appearing in support of the brilliant presentation I heard from the three members of Moreton Enterprises, Buffy, Eliza, and Ellie. And I have to say what I heard from them is what many investors would like to hear from the CEOs or the senior management of the company they own. It was bright, it was aggressive, it was optimistic, but it was humble, acknowledging things that could have been done different, that could have been done better. And this is what I would like to talk about today. The headline of the speech that it was suggested that I delivered, that I give you, talks about what's the connection in the world that we live in today between EU debate, Brexit, fragmentation, nationalism, artificial intelligence, the rise of China, and many other things. Are these things connected at all? But what I left out of the headline of the speech is, how is that relevant to the bright, young, hardworking, motivating, impressive graduates of this school and many other schools around the world, because they are the ones who will have to manage this world going forward. Not to say that everything we, the sort of older folks, have done was all bad, but there are very, very significant issues today. Very, very significant challenges as well as opportunities that must be addressed. And they do deserve a different, fresh, more aggressive look. And I will talk about that a little bit later on. So I would like personally to thank Buffy, Eliza, Ellie, and all their colleagues at Moreton Enterprises for this look that they gave us into the future. With leaders such as them, I certainly feel comfortable that the right things would be done, that the right initiatives, even if it's not a direct incarnation of the business that they're running today, the next generation, hopefully, will do a better job than we have. So I'd certainly like to congratulate them. Why don't we give them a round of applause? To Buffy, Eliza, Ellie, and all their colleagues, there's three things I would like to discuss today with you in a free-form fashion. I'll take some questions afterwards on any subject you'd care to ask me. But the first one is try and take stock of where we are today. And I want to talk a minute about capitalism. This is not just because I've been working for investment banks and the stock exchange, as it was appropriately described, the beating heart of the city, but also the beating heart, or it should be. It is not always, actually, as a matter of fact, the beating heart of the real economy. But where is capitalism today? And in fact, in our economies, in our societies, capitalism may not be the preferred model. You hear that from some in the political class, but we are starting to hear growing clamors for deep, radical changes in the way we manage wealth creation. And not just in Western Europe, but in the all capitalist of all countries, the United States today. I want to talk a little bit about that and how relevant this is to us today. The second thing is, what do we make of it? If we take stock, how relevant is that to what we've heard before, those who are seeking to innovate, those budding entrepreneurs, and how they can help us use, and in fact, grow a capitalist model to achieve success, to achieve wealth creation. And thirdly, where I'd like to conclude, it might be a little bit big picture for some of you, and I apologize in advance. But where is the world going today? We're seeing at the same time rising opportunities, certainly in the world of technology, for example, where it seems that there's no limit to what man or woman or the human race can do as a whole. And at the same time, we're seeing challenges that we've seen before. Politicians, nationalism, other forms of political challenges, but we've never seen them as we see them today on the basis of an imbricated, globalized human society where even minor steps that are taken in one nation, one corner of the world, immediately reverberate on many other things that all of us do in our daily lives. And how do we manage that conflict? And what sort of world going forward are we going to leave to the younger generations? More importantly, what are they going to do and make of it and do about it? First, capitalism. I think one thing we can all agree on is that capitalism has won. If you go back 20, 30, 40 years ago, 1/6 of the world population, more or less, was capitalist. Others operated in various regimes, either dirigist regimes, centralized, state economies, communist, or variations around the theme of common ownership. But the majority of the world's population was not operating under a regime that we could have described as capitalist. What is capitalism? Capitalism is, in my mind, in my own mind, just a way of allocating capital on the basis of competing offering, adjusting for risk to seek a return. But what of the unintended, or certainly there's no such thing as a sort of a capitalist engine somewhere, conscious capitalist governance ruling the markets. One of the consequences of capitalism is something that's had a profound impact on human society, certainly over the last 200 years or so human history, and that is innovation. Whilst at the time, when budding capitalists, when capital accumulation was starting enough to the point where income from capitalism, capital gains, was being reinvested in the real economy, there was no sense that capitalism itself, which was a means of personal enrichment, would actually, in several generations, about a dozen generations, generate more innovation of a technological nature, service nature, across the spectrum of economic activity than we ever had in the history of the world in the preceding 4,000 to 5,000 years. And one of these unexpected consequences is what I believe has meant and resulted in capitalism, perhaps with the exception of 3 countries, Cuba, North Korea, and I think up until recently my own native country, eschewing capitalism as an operating model. But that ability that capitalism had to promote innovation is what led to new science, new services that created wealth, and that ultimately created value that help human society make progress. And this is a model today that is being deeply challenged, including in this country, in the rest of Europe, in the United States. But why is it that capitalism is a challenge? Well, there's things that none of us do like, or, for example, that have been attributed to capitalism, the 1%, 99%, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But also the boom-bust cycle, and I'll also talk about that, and the reason why capitalism seems to have these periods of intense expansion followed by crashes. Because if you analyze carefully in the history of capitalism, every single financial crisis has had the same root causes and the same effects. And other than transferring for the particular technological application of the day, the last 150 to 200 years of capitalist history, we've seen exactly the same pattern happen again and again and again. And 2008 was absolutely no different from the preceding crisis. But that's where we are today. And when we look at capitalism and the ability of a great number of investors to make ultimately what are going to be the smartest decisions to create the greatest returns going forward, we've seen innovation coming out of that box in a way that we haven't seen from other models of economic development. Why? Because I think it's intuitive that a small number, as bright as they may be, either a dictator or a small number of elite, you have the énarques, for example, in France, or look around the world where economies have had a mixed model, a small coterie of elite by themselves are unable. They can certainly drive certain directions. They can push human society in a certain direction. But they don't have the richness, the wealth of innovative ideas that only a massive amount of investors making simultaneous investment decisions can yield in terms of the promotion of innovation. And I'd like to talk a couple of minutes the reasons why I believe that capitalism is being challenged today, specifically in Western markets, in the UK, rest of Europe, and the United States. But not so for those of you who travel to China, travel to India, to Africa, which was a net exporter of capital until 2008 and has become a net importer since then. Latin America, the country today where you hear the greatest political and civil support for globalization and capitalism, in my experience, is China, by a long shot. So why is it that in our Western markets this model seems to no longer harness support, but we're hearing quite a different message in the 5/6 of the world that in the last 15 to 20 years have rejoined our capitalist model? My humble opinion, it has to do with competition. The recalibration of the world economy towards capitalism means that today, if you're a student, an investor, a manager, a producer, an industrialist, a farmer, you have to compete. Whereas in the past, 1/6 of the world population had an effective de facto monopoly on the capitalist economy. And the realities of that competition, and it did come in initially through cheaper labor, through the cost side of the equation, but that is no longer the case. Today, you'll find that some nations, either deemed to be emerging markets or competing on the basis of lower cost, cheaper labor, are no longer competing on that basis. 18 months ago, a nation launched the world's first quantum satellite. Even the President of the United States, perhaps not known to be the world's most famous expert on quantum mechanics or quantum satellite communication, acknowledged that the United States was behind in that area and needed to catch up. And I won't bore you with the benefits of potential quantum communications or quantum computing, but that country is China. And that was done 18 months ago. And for those of you who understand it, a successful quantum satellite, quantum communication, could give you instant communication with almost unlimited throughput, regardless of the distance between 2 points, and in a fashion that is totally and mathematically impenetrable to any attempts, whether it's hacking or stealing of information. So we are now competing in that area and many others in space, in cellular technology, with countries that have understood the power of capitalism to generate innovation, new value, better life for all of us, for human beings, but also a substantial competitive advantage. And if you look at the history of nations, one will see that nations typically derive through 4 elements in their sort of portfolio, political or business portfolio. They derive through 4 elements a competitive advantage or lack thereof. Of course, their military capabilities, and some nations still dominate the world. The UK is doing pretty well, although, of course, there are nations that are mightier in that area. Your diplomatic network. The UK has one of the largest in the world. Of course, the economic might of a country, how much it exports, where its products are sold, its ability to create wealth and job is a very, very important component. But the last one, and the one that probably matters the most today, is technology, your ability to not only be mighty economically, and that can be on the basis of cost or efficiencies, but your ability to innovate. And I see today the greatest potential for direct confrontation between high-performance, mighty nations in the area of technology, whilst there is a lot of talk about, and we've heard some recently, potential nuclear confrontation between the United States and North Korea, or there's currently a live debate, for example, between Russia and the United Kingdom. The truth is that the potential for direct military confrontation or some form of confrontation that involves violence and force is quite limited if you consider the economic implication that this would have. Not impossible, but one area where countries compete all out as brutally as they can because it doesn't involve an immediate risk of violence or political confrontation, even military confrontation. And an area where it is particularly vital, I think, for the UK, for Europe, and some of the older capitalist nations to do better than they have, certainly in the last 10 to 15 years, is technology. That is the one area where competition today is incredibly brutal. And one area where, in fact, countries like the UK have some of the basic ingredients for continued, and I emphasize the word continued, global success. And this is where I want to talk a little bit for a few minutes before I take it on to what does that mean for a young, hardworking, dynamic, smart young graduates of schools like Moreton and many others. But before I get to that, why is it that in our Western markets, besides that competitive need to now, having established a level playing field globally, that nations in the West need to take another look at the way they're generating innovation and technology? It is because the particular way in which capital is distributed, particularly in Europe, and that applies to the UK as well, is in fact not particularly capitalist. It's quite oligopolistic, and is no longer the best way, and certainly never has been, way to develop and scale up the startups that promote and create that innovation. And I want to refer in particular to a specific feature of funding in our, I would say, European markets, and I speak in a geographical sense here. I'm conscious that probably half the room, either to my right or to my left, are convinced Brexiters, whilst the Ramonas on the other side are obviously looking at them and saying, what is he going to say next? But putting that aside, more than 80% of the sources of corporate funding in Europe today come from one single source, bank lending. And when you look at the origin of capitalism, it wasn't about banks lending. When you hear politicians talking about funding the economy, they think of bank lending. If you're an entrepreneur, if you're coming out of Moreton or elsewhere, university, do you want to borrow money, having to pay it back every month, perhaps mortgage your home or some other family assets? That is not the way you fund innovation. You fund innovation through long-term patient capital, where you're not asked to basically provide guarantees against the risk of lending. The returns, of course, being fixed income returns, are capped, where the investor takes the risk of a potential failure, does not ask you for coupon payments every month, doesn't ask you for guarantees, but in exchange for that capital commitment, receives one very precious thing, which is a thing that has been lost in our European capital model today: access to the upside. Our European economies are almost entirely dependent on bank lending. A bank will receive limited upside, limited yields, will want, of course, to protect the risk to their balance sheet of an SME, an entrepreneur defaulting, so they'll ask for protection. Fundamentally, debt is a downside-focused instrument, focusing on default, whereas equity is an upside-focused. What's the maximum profit you can make making an equity investment? There is no mathematical limitation, 100%, 1,000%, 100,000%. It is that upside that effectively pays for all the other risks that you're taking, default, business failures, and others. But what is the important thing in our current funding model that makes capitalism unpopular? I mentioned the 1%, 99%. That's an issue. Capitalism no longer benefits or accrues wealth to a vast majority of the population. And the second thing, of course, is the boom-bust cycle. Well, let me give you a few statistics. These are French statistics, but they're not very different in the UK. Because of the over-reliance on bank lending as a primary source of funding, The last asset quality review of the European central banks revealed that the three largest French banks, for example, 2 years ago, statistics are a bit dated, their balance sheet were equal in size to the balance sheets of the three largest American banks, which is an economy 7 times larger. So that highlights one point. If you depend on a debt mechanism, mostly bank, as essentially a source, a sole and growing source of funding for your economy, not only is that type of capital not suitable for startup and scale-ups, but these banks are by nature going to be highly leveraged. And when they fail, they take down the economy with them. The second point, the 1%, 99%, is an important one. And one which I believe is one of the current challenges that our capital distribution model is facing. And the UK is better positioned than the rest in Europe, but certainly not the best position globally. It is, of course, that banks, in leveraging their balance sheet, rely on the public powers of central banks, who allow them to leverage their balance sheet. And so by relying on a form of funding that is essentially leveraged, where your lender needs to multiply the amount of equity they own in terms of the balance sheet exposure that they secure, you are not only taking risk in case of failure, but also because the banking industry in Europe is highly concentrated. 2 to 3 banks, typically in most European countries, with one exception, typically concentrate in the region of 75% of all sources of funding, lending, mortgages, and capital collection from retail as well as institutional customers. And that creates a model of distribution of capital that comes from the top, where essentially central banks and governments have a very important say in terms of ultimately who gets access to capital. That's very efficient and a very good model if you're a large company. If you have a lot of assets, plants, equipment, cash flows, you can arrange a loan in a couple of weeks, maybe even less, at very advantageous terms. And nothing is what I'm saying should effectively make you conclude that bank funding is not a quick and efficient way to fund the real economy in terms of very large established businesses. But where it doesn't work is for the small and mid-sized enterprise. Simply, as I explained before, because that type of capital is not well suited to high-risk-taking, innovative, entrepreneurial businesses, but also because the returns for the banks are not very satisfactory. Now, and I will conclude there in terms of the analysis as to why the lending debt-based leverage model is so prevalent in Europe today. The opposite of what it is, for example, in the United States and increasingly in emerging markets. Debt is heavily subsidized. Last year, the taxpayers of the European Union, which, at least for now, you are a part of, spent 570 billion euros for all of the EU, subsidizing debt in the financial services industry, particularly the banking industry. That's hard cash, effectively, that did not accrue to the treasuries of the EU, effectively, which ended up coming out of the pocket of taxpayers. Where's that long-term patient capital that is well-designed and geared towards the funding of risk-taking, of innovation, of entrepreneurs? We heard 3 of them earlier, of course, operating on a modest scale. But the particular funding tool, equity, where risk is shared, and which is the best way to help scale up those startups. There are 5.4 million SMEs in the UK today. That vehicle called equity in the EU is taxed 4 times through its life cycle. Income tax, of course, on profits, the same sterling or euro of equity income, capital gains, dividend, and the financial transaction tax, which is another cost on equity capital, which is called stamp duty in the UK and which is called other things in the rest of Europe. And in fact, if you look at the post-tax, pre-return cost differential, before you make any money on capital invested, in the EU on average, if you make an investment through debt versus make an investment through equity, there's a fiscal difference of 40%. You need to make 40% on your equity investment before you're fiscally neutral with debt. That has a huge impact on the way we fund small and mid-sized enterprise. And this is one of the reasons why at the London Stock Exchange, we've made it a mantra of ours. It is really important that politicians, decision makers, not just treasury officials, members of parliament, understand that the very deep bias in the way we fund our real economy is making us dependent on bank lending, and particularly lending or debt, making our economies more fragile, and forcing a distribution of capital which tends to benefit large companies and is, of course, under the watchful eye and control of government, versus a model which is fundamentally far more democratic, where you distribute capital at the bottom, where investors entrust their capital directly to entrepreneurs, business people, people taking risks. And that distribution through market mechanism is substantially atrophied. The UK actually does better than the rest of Europe in that respect. 5.4 million SMEs, I mentioned, out of 23 million SMEs. It is by far the largest contingent, twice as many SMEs as you'd find in Germany, France, or Italy, which are comparable economies. And what do we make of that? How can we recalibrate that to create new wealth and innovation that our economies desperately need? Nassim Taleb described an SME economy as an anti-fragile economy. Economies that resist strategic surprises. Brexit is certainly one for many people in business. Even though some might have a wish for Brexit, it is definitely a challenge and a surprise for many businesses. Could be some other forms of challenges, geopolitical events of all sorts. But the way you handle these strategic surprises is not necessarily so much by anticipating all of them, which is, of course, impossible for any single person to do, but by ensuring that your economy is far more resistant, able to take these shocks and respond quickly. This is, by nature, the characteristic of a small and mid-sized enterprise economy that is funded through equity. The one major crisis, capitalist crisis we had that was fundamentally an equity crisis in 2001. The internet bubble blew up. Within less than a year, world economies had completely recovered. In fact, aggregate indices had recovered and were trading even higher. Whereas the depth of a debt crisis will take you a decade or more. We're still working through some of the after effects of excessive leverage. So that's about the capitalist economy and how a recalibration of our fiscal and regulatory policies could make it easier for the young folks that we've just heard earlier, Buffy, Eliza, and Ellie, to secure that long-term patient capital for when they are seriously minded about launching their business in a few years' time when they come out of university. And this is where I would like to give you a sense, in terms of your careers, particularly for those of you who are in the back, students from Moreton and other schools. If you look at the way we've been running economy, we've been running countries, certainly for the last 10 to 20 years, many of you, I'm sure, have questions. Was there so much violence? Why can't we seem to resolve some fundamental issues? Why is there so much antagonism between nations? I think it's the good book, Matthew chapter 24, talks about nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom. It feels that way sometimes. And what can you do about it? And is the establishment, when people talk about the city, maybe the London Stock Exchange, prestigious organizations? Well, what I want to tell you and suggest that in things that have been done in the past, successes, the creation of a lot of innovation, new wealth, are the roots of success. But don't necessarily think that imitating all of us, older generation, is going to be the way forward for you. In fact, I would argue that it isn't. Focus on new ideas, focus on innovation, enterprise. This is really where the future is. Sadly, we all heard that Stephen Hawking passed away yesterday. There was one thing that he said that I will always remember. In fact, kind of said the same thing as Elon Musk, a very well-known innovator, who were arguing for the colonization of space, Mars being the next step, Not so much because they felt that this would, be an adventurous, fun thing to do, but because, and they stated that explicitly, they weren't so sure that humanity today was managing its affair in a fashion that was so efficient that they thought we could consider our own survival on this planet as assured. One discussed it as even a basket. Let's not put, and that was Stephen Hawking, let's not put all our eggs in that basket because we don't know if we are even going to remain an owner of this basket. So some very smart people are thinking of the future, for example, of space colonization, not so much as an exciting, adventurous thing to do, which it clearly is, but as a way to hedge our own survival and the future of development of the human race on Earth. Now, that may seem a little bit gloomy, but these are pretty smart people. So what is it that we can do in this current environment of recalibration of the world economy towards a single model that all nations compete on? What is it that we can do to make it no longer appear to be a zero-sum game, but an environment, particularly where our younger generation can make a real difference? And I think it boils down to one single concept and word, and that's innovation. And this is where equity capital is great. And if we were to develop easier access to long-term sources of capital, I think we can leverage in a very convincing and frankly more efficient fashion the 5.4 million SMEs. Now, clearly hundreds of thousands, if not a million or two of them, don't have the potential for scale up. But what about if 1 million of them have a potential to not only increase by 10, 20, 30%, but increase by 1,000 or 10,000% their level of activity, as we've seen a lot of tech businesses do in the US, for example, where only 18% of all sources of funding come from leverage, banks, balance sheet. And the rest is a wide array of capital market solutions that are frankly far easier to tap for businesses looking to scale up. And so the only suggestion I would make to the younger generations is, whilst a lot of things have been done, a lot of innovation, a lot of new technology, a lot of bright opportunities exist today, don't necessarily think that the establishment in itself or the way we've done things should be your main focus and aspiration. Perhaps it is, and that's fine too. But try to think beyond your ability today to understand things without the biases, the experience, success, or lack thereof, of older generations, to understand things in a new way, to look at ways to apply innovation to new science, new services, your willingness to take risks. Again, at the core of capitalism, it is about risk-taking. It's not about protection against downside, which is a specifically debt-based philosophy and mentality. What I do think, the impact that you can have on your generation today can reverberate way beyond commercial, economic, or scientific success. I spent last week a few hours with a gentleman by the name of Erel Margarit, who is a member of the Knesset in Israel. He's a PhD from Jerusalem University, but he's also a venture capital investor. Has invested in some of the top technology that Israel has seen. And the project he has prosecuted for the last 10 years, and this is where enterprise, a new form of capitalism, and resolving our geopolitical issues, I think, come together. He's created 7 centers in Israel based on local expertise, some agribusiness, some software, some biosciences. He's picked some of the poorest part of Israel. He's brought in some academic talent. He's brought in some companies. Huge success. As you know, Israel is not called the innovation nation for nothing. And he didn't just, of course, do it just on his own. But this ability that he had to see the potential of creating clusters of innovation together with capital, equity, companies in some of the poorest areas of Israel was a huge success. And if you look at the way these locations looked 10 years ago and the way they look today, it's like going from the Dark Ages to Silicon Valley. And they have quite a few of them. But he didn't stop there. He then called on friends and business associates and governments in Morocco, in Jordan, in Tunisia, in Italy, in Turkey, in France, and many other countries, and said, why don't we do this around the Mediterranean? We've been fighting for thousands of years. But one thing we can all agree on, one thing that we can actually communicate is SMEs, innovation, and giving a different sense of hope and opportunity to the younger generation. And it now has 10 related centers throughout the Mediterranean, including Muslim countries or countries that are politically certainly not aligned with Israel, working together. At the London Stock Exchange 3 years ago, we created a platform called Elite, designed to fund private unlisted companies, some very young, youngest 7 months old, some very old. The oldest actually is almost 700 years old. It's an Italian business. But this platform was designed to help SMEs understand how to raise long-term capital and equities, introduce them to investors, to help accelerate their pace of growth, help accelerate their ability to innovate. Within 2.5 years, 1,000 companies have joined. It now operates in Russia and the Ukraine, in Morocco and Israel. Recently launched a platform in China, operates throughout the EU, of course. The UK is one of its home markets. Has recently launched in Mexico, recently launched in Canada, in Brazil, UAE, Saudi Arabia. This is the one thing that everywhere I've seen it brings people together. The UK has an amazing success rate, accomplishment on a European scale at fostering innovation and young companies. What the UK is not doing quite so well is scaling them up to global success. But an SME, it can have maybe 5 or 10 employees. A great innovation is never going to limit the scope of its marketing to a local market or a national market. You can be an SME operating right here, right outside the doors of Moreton, and have a global strategy, sell your products or your technology in China, in Brazil, and elsewhere. And nowhere have I found a politician across the aisle, to the far left, the far right, the center, anywhere else, in autocratic, dictatorships, democratic, and every model in between. Nowhere have I met, I would say, even rather extreme politician who argued against innovation, argued against the development of SMEs. And SMEs have another characteristic, is they don't all, in fact very few do, not that many, operate singly in a capital. It's not so much about the city and London, or Paris, or New York. They operate all over the place, often connected to academic clusters. And if in fact you combine academic clusters with SMEs and with the funding resources, particularly around equity, you can work miracles, which even politicians have to notice. And that, to me, is one of the solutions. And the contribution that you, the younger generations, particularly those of you out the back, listening politely and maybe figuring, what is he talking about? That is what you can do to make the world a better place. Whether your focus is a national focus, whether you feel citizen of somewhere, or whether you want to feel a citizen of everywhere, which is certainly what I would encourage you to consider. Look around the world, the opportunities are immense. But innovation spreads very quickly. Everybody wants it. Innovation brings you pricing power. Pricing power gives you, of course, wealth creation, which gives you the opportunity to create good jobs, not just cost-focused, cost savings articulated jobs. It's innovation that's made capitalism successful. So why don't we make it easier, if we want to make capitalism popular again, for popular capitalism, which is not London-centric. And in fact, some of the criticisms sometimes leveled at the city of being sort of self-centered or focused a little too much on its own balance sheet or its own profit, in my opinion, come directly from the heavy subsidization of debt and leverage. Because if you're a financial services industry, company, bank, can be others, And you can very cheaply, in fact, you enjoy a subsidy coming from the deductibility of interest from borrowing. You're going to be very tempted to build up your balance sheet. And it's not going to be loans to SMEs or risky businesses. It might be other risky businesses, but things that are on the balance sheet. Can be subprime, can be securitized derivatives, and instruments that sometimes are not so well understood. And I know today, when you think Brexit, the debate, when you look at artificial intelligence, the rise of China, these things may seem disconnected. In my view, they're part of one and the same question. What future governance? And to me, that's the most important question we can ask ourselves today. You know, we can worry about climate change, nuclear war, and many other things, migration, access to drinking water, access to food. There's a range of issues that are major for humanity today. But to me, the question and the way you resolve that is, what governance do we want for these issues? Can any nation today resolve climate change on its own? Can any nation manage a severe financial crisis on its own? Can any nation resolve migration issues, access to energy, transportation, intellectual property? It's simply not possible. And what I think we're seeing in Western markets, given that the rules of the game have changed, competition is tougher, there's now a level playing field where effectively we're competing with the other 7 billion individuals on this planet. And it's much harder than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. But the real question today is, are we competing in a fashion where a governance, and I think it will start with financial services. There's a big debate, for example, Brexit related, about whether euro clearing should stay in London or move back to the EU. I'm happy to take questions on that later. Or whether all the US dollars that are cleared here should move back to the US. There's a clear tension in Western markets with a sense that the past was better. Make America great again. That the national accomplishments in the past, British Empire or other things, means that we can go our own. We can be protectionists. We can separate. We can fragment. We can dissociate ourselves from the rest of the world. But the flip side to that, and the changes, for example, that have happened in my native country, France, in my opinion, are remarkable. For 42 years, France was an underperforming country. We're great. We don't need anybody else. Quite protectionist. Not a lot of support for innovation. A new leader appeared fairly recently. France now wants to compete because they think they can innovate, and they're pro-globalization. And so when you start projecting in a global economy a model which says, well, you know what, America or the UK or France or Italy, they can actually compete. They can do well. They can win, perhaps not everywhere, but only if they innovate. And for this is where capital, where I think careers for our younger generation, in the uses and distribution of capital to fund the real economy, are very exciting. Sitting there on the desk in the bank, looking at ways you can invest the bank's own capital in complex derivatives product, complex portfolio, can bring liquidity to the market. It certainly means a lot more risk for the bank, and regulations make it more difficult today. But is that the fun part? And I've been on all sides of that equation. Is that the fun part of a career in finance today? I don't think so. Whilst equities represented, at the end of last year, less than 5% of the London Stock Exchange Group. London Stock Exchange cleared, settled, and traded over $1 quadrillion of securities and notional around the world. Today has 95% of the clearing of over-the-counter derivatives in the entire world. That includes Asia, the United States, of course, the Eurozone, and the UK. Has $15 trillion of assets in the benchmark in its index division. It's a massive regulatory index as well as balance sheet business. And the business that you think of, the equities, is really very, very important. Actually, that was my best part. But not necessarily so much the big IPOs. But getting this army of 5.4 million companies, 23 million companies in the EU, and now well over 150 million companies around the world, who have no clue as to how they can get the right type of capital, how they can raise it and expand their ambition. Help them to think upside rather than protecting the downside against default. That's the fun part for all of you out there considering a career in finance. funding entrepreneurs. First of all, they're great people to work with. They're excited, they're positive, they want to change the world. It's Elon Musk shipping a car off to Mars that for a few trillion years, at least as long as the orbits are maintained, is basically go orbit the Mars Earth ellipse. That's the sort of ambition, enthusiasm that is really great to work with. And nothing warmed my heart more today than hearing some of your graduates already creating their business, thinking of enterprise. That's how we're going to change the world. The way we've been doing business, the way we've been distributing capital, in my opinion, is suboptimal today. And we have an opportunity not only to create new wealth, leverage that army of 5.4 million businesses that operate today in the UK and elsewhere around the world, making our economy less dependent on excessive subsidized leverage in the financial industry, which is the reason why we find it so hard to recover from a crisis of the type we had in 2008 and every single major crisis in the history of capitalism for the last 200 years. It's leverage. It takes a long time to recover. So let's deleverage and let's use sources of capital to fund entrepreneurs who can then be citizens of somewhere, but also citizens in everywhere. I'm convinced that this is a huge opportunity, certainly for the UK. I'm convinced that the pattern of retrenchment in the West, of thinking that the past was better, that we should revert to a position of grandeur, which came out of either building an empire or establishing economic dominance, which is, by the way, still very real, still alive today. A lot of innovation continues to come out of Western market, but living in the past is not the way. The way is empowering the next generations through enterprise, through much easier access to long-term patient capital, to rejuvenate that cycle of innovation so that more of that innovation, because the Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, the Brazilians, and many others, Africa is a huge recipient of global capital at the moment. We need to compete. We can win. This is very exciting, and I certainly would like to encourage any of the soon-to-be graduates or some of the younger generations to consider finance at the service of the real economy. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm sure I've exceeded the time that was allocated to me. I'll take any questions that you may have on any subject you'd like to ask. Thank you.